in my view, the vaccine-related cases were always doomed to failure. The arguments that were raised in relation to those vaccine cases, the one that Nathan brought, ultimately they ended up being very scattershot. They didn't have a very strong legal basis. They were going to be Hail Mary throws at the very start of the game. Totalitarianism and authoritarianism is not the product of just a boot on your neck. It's also the state of mind that it puts its citizens in. The thing about totalitarian regimes like you have in Iran is that they're not going around and beating every woman that has her hair uncovered, right?
Yeah.
They go around and they make an example out of one, and then the others will all self-edit. You had people like that who have physical illnesses or mental illnesses, and they would be stuck in a hotel room with no other contact for 2 weeks, essentially being tortured. I had one who was suicidal, calling me at all hours of the night. These people genuinely suffered.
Start recording over there, make sure audio is working. Yes, sound's there. It's not perfect. We could be doing labs, but
No, it's all good.
it's always good enough. All right.
Yeah.
Cameron Shamsabad,
Good to be joining you, Chris.
thanks for joining us here.
My pleasure.
For those who don't know Cam, he works in the legal profession and is still an accredited...
I'm a solicitor.
You're a solicitor
I'm a solicitor. Yeah.
in the Law Society, so they're actively practicing.
Yeah, I'm actively practicing. I practice in North Sydney. That's where my office is at the moment.
And
And I work around Sydney.
And I've asked you in today because I wanted to talk to you about one side of the freedom movement, which gets a lot of headlines,
Yeah,
but not always for the right reasons.
that's right.
Now, there have been a lot of good cases, some bad cases, maybe a lot more bad cases than good cases. But to try and understand them, look, we've seen the headlines, we've seen the PDFs, we've seen the noise and the commentary, but trying to get behind it, Cam, thanks for joining us to try and explain some more of this.
Happy to join.
Where do we start? I mean, when I mention fighting the fines, fighting the lockdowns in a court of law,
Sure.
what's the first thing that comes to mind?
First thing that comes to mind is the chaos that occurred. I mean, the reality is no one was prepared for the kind of legal environment that we would be stepping into. And the reality is I think a lot of the legal profession was somewhat taken by surprise with how quickly things evolved and the kind of law that we would be dealing with during the pandemic. It was obviously unprecedented in a number of ways, but legally, I think we had never had that kind of draconian response from the government, and the legal profession had never had to counter that by comparison. If you look at countries like the US, we have more regularly, executive government involvement in civil rights. I always use the example of Trump's border closures, for example, in relation to, specifically in relation to the Muslim ban that he put on. You had lawyers at the airport writing habeas corpus writs for courts to file them in courts. And it's because the American system of government and the way things have unfolded in America, lawyers are much, much more comfortable responding to things that are ongoing and emerging in that sense. It's not a dig at the Australian legal profession in any meaningful sense. It's just we haven't had that experience in this country before, where you would need to have lawyers in the trenches, sort of giving advice as things are unfolding. I had an experience where people were calling me, and I did a little bit of work, obviously, with the Fight the Fines campaign that Rebel News put on. And they were asking me what are the sort of legalities around, for example, ID being requested, or exemptions, or medical records being requested. And it was hard to answer because the rules were changing so quickly that at the end of the day, the advice I give this week might not be reflective of the advice I have to give next week. It was hard for lawyers to keep up, let alone the general public. So I think that the first thing that pops to mind when I think of pandemic lawyering is chaos, because it was a very chaotic period. And then the second thing that pops to mind is, the good and the bad that ended up coming out of that. I think a lot of the really great lawyers of our state and of our country sort of hung back a little bit to see what was going to happen and to sort of deal with things as things were sort of settling down a little bit more, because you can have a clearer perspective. But at the same time as that, there was also a need for those people to be on the front foot in order to sort of prevent some of the ambulance chasing types from jumping into the mix and stealing the thunder.
And that's how I want to talk about it. I want to come to some good cases, but I also want to talk about the reputation, rightly or wrongly, that's been written about that a lot of people have ended up as ambulance chasers. And the lead headline when you Google this, you end up with is one Nathan Buckley. He's the smiling, grinning face of what many in large mainstream media, and even outside that, have fairly, from reading this, from an outsider, non-legal outsider, have questioned this. Nathan Buckley and the cases he's raised. Did he raise good cases?
Look, in some sense, I mean, the reality is his matters were filed. He obviously thought they were good. In my view, the vaccine-related cases were always doomed to a kind of failure. It's not to say that, that they shouldn't be argued in some capacity, but I think that the arguments that were raised in relation to those vaccine cases, the one that Nathan brought, and also the ones that were brought by Tony, I think ultimately they ended up being very scattershot. They didn't have a very strong legal basis. As I said, things are very chaotic in this pandemic that occurred in this pandemic, but the law was not really decided in such a way that these cases would be clear cases. They were going to be scattershot. They were going to be, Hail Mary throws at the very start of the game.
A Hail Mary throw. So at the outset, these cases were Hail Marys.
Yes, they were Hail Marys. In my view, they were Hail Marys, and I made that view known to quite a few colleagues. But for me, I'm obviously a junior solicitor as well. So some of these guys, they've had experience, they've had a lot of practice. They probably thought, well, you know what, someone's got to do something. And that's the other side to this. People were demanding that there is a legal solution to this problem. There's no way they'd accept that that's not correct, that there had to be a legal solution, which means that you had a whole lot of lawyers promising the world that they were going to have the case that's going to shoot a hole straight through this and just wipe out all the public health orders. And that was what a lot of these guys, they actually promised. They promised that this would be an end to vaccine mandates, lockdowns, whatever it would be. And the reality is that was never going to occur in this context. I was always thinking of it as, if we're going to run challenges, and I thought this is what the profession should be doing, we should be running challenges on settled points of law, such as constitutionally implied freedoms and whatnot, which are not perfect grounds. It's not the equivalent of like a US First Amendment. But ultimately, they give us a fairly strong basis to nip at the heels of these things. I was very strong on the position that there should be a minimum protection, for example, of protest rights and political freedoms during the pandemic. But the idea that we were going to be able to run a larger argument, for example, in relation to an implied freedom of movement within a state, or a right to a kind of bodily autonomy that would supersede any of these state legislations and regulations was something that was never going to occur. The state governments have always had an extremely wide ambit of power, and there's very, very narrow sort of limitations that you can apply to that. The vaccine cases, I always felt, were attempting to achieve far too much. I don't think within our constitutional system of government you could actually get those up, and in the end none of them did get up, actually. In the Fair Work Commission, there's probably one being decided every other week, and most of them, if not all of them, have gone down. There's been a couple where there have been great success, but ultimately a lot of them go down because the country, the way it's structured constitutionally, just doesn't permit those kinds of arguments to flourish. State governments have what's referred to as plenary power. Unless you can find a limit within the federal constitution, you end up getting stuck with whatever the state government decides, which can mean very odious and tyrannical laws at times. It's not like if I can say, for example, in the US, we have state constitutions that have state bills of rights, and then that's got an extra layer on top, which is the federal system of government that has its own bill of rights as well on top of that. So, for example, in the US, you had difficulties enforcing, for example, political repressions in relation to protests or church closures or whatnot, because there was a very clear First Amendment in place that protected people on those rights. In Australia, there was nothing like that. So I had people coming to me that were churches, they were pastors from churches. They had been given $40,000 fines for opening their church secretly during a lockdown. And that fine,
isn't that absurd? But
of course it's absurd.
Beyond absurd, anyone would hear what you just had said there, and $40,000 for opening a church during lockdown. Even plausibly, if they held that service outdoors in the car park, the same fine sounds like it would would have plausibly been issued for
It
a
would.
public
Yes.
a public gathering, and people hear that and they just want to flip tables over it and say there must be some legal basis for this.
Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah.
but the reality is
No,
this.
there's a legal basis for them giving the fine. There isn't in this country, so far as has been on the laws that we've dealt with and the interpretations of our constitutional system. There's nothing that would prevent the government from doing that, which is a concern I've had for many years before the pandemic, and now during the pandemic, it's highlighted the I think fatal errors that exist within our system, that it can actually withstand the weight of very severe draconian restrictions. I mean, I had and I can't get into too many particulars, but I had a woman who was coming back from Mexico on stage 4. She had been getting treatment for stage 4 breast cancer, and she was essentially coming back to die. She was finished with her course of chemotherapy, and she was coming back. She had no hope of surviving cancer, and she was stuck in quarantine for 2 weeks.
Oh.
They stuck her in a hotel. It didn't matter how many letters we sent to the New South Wales Health Department. It continued to be the case that she was stuck in quarantine. I had a woman in Queensland who was issued a border declaration pass that says she didn't have to quarantine. When she got to the Queensland, past the Queensland border, she got to the Gold Coast or Brisbane. They told her she did have to quarantine. They stuck her in a quarantine facility. Within that same period of 2 weeks where she was in quarantine, a family member, her son, attempted suicide. And despite the representations we sent to the Queensland Department of Health, they refused to allow her an exemption to the quarantine period while her son was in hospital having attempted suicide. She couldn't go and see him. So the inhumanity that occurred during that period of time was extreme. And I was the first one. I was active in trying to assist people with pro bono legal advice, with fighting the fines, whatever it was, trying to get people outcomes that were rational and reasonable and trying to fight for justice. I was successful only to a certain degree as far as the system would allow me, as far as my system would, my experience would permit me to have. But at the end of the day, I knew going into that, there was no silver bullet. This was going to be a very, very hard period, and I hoped that it would produce growing pains for us as a country, as opposed to a kind of social regression, which in some sense I think we got a bit of both at the end of this.
How did you explain to someone who's facing their last weeks, plausibly spending them in a hotel room, unable? You're on the phone with this lady,
yeah,
and she's explaining her story to you. How do you what do you say? What do you tell her?
There's not much you can say. I mean, that's the other thing, and the other issue is you're having to work very, very quickly in the hopes that you can get an outcome. If you can't get an outcome within a short period of time, the quarantine period ends within 2 weeks anyway. So by the time you get around through all the correspondence and you try and get to the bottom of it, she's already at the end of the quarantine period and she's had to suffer through the 2 weeks. I mean, but the hardest part is, you had people like that who have physical illnesses, or my other clients that would have, for example, mental illnesses, and they would be stuck in a hotel room with no other contact for 2 weeks, essentially being tortured. I had one who was suicidal, calling me at all hours of the night. It was for me, it was extremely stressful, and that's the start of my career. And this is the thing that's obviously quite largely dismissed. I see it now being dismissed. Oh, well, it was not that big a deal. But it really was to these people. These people genuinely suffered. They were genuinely subject to these draconian restrictions.
If that quarantine wasn't that big a deal, then Nicole Kidman and other celebrities would not have had a problem doing it.
But
they didn't. They had specialty plans made for them so that they could self-quarantine in their own luxury abodes.
That's right. And can I say the other perverse aspect is I still know of people who are getting chased for their quarantine bills. This particular woman that I'm talking about, I can't give too many more particulars than that. More than 8 months after, or close to a year after now, actually, the Queensland Department of Health is still chasing her to pay the quarantine bill that she incurred involuntarily.
Interstate quarantine bill.
Yeah. Wow. Well, she was a Queensland resident returning home, and her own state has told her she has to pay thousands of dollars. And this is a woman who's a pensioner. She doesn't have the funds to be able to pay for these things. She's stuck in a no-win position.
let me take us back to the legal challenges if
Sure.
we can. We spoke a little bit about Nathan, who's been is the right word disbarred or struck off?
He was suspended.
He was suspended.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of the cases he raised, you said earlier, just were Hail Mary, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
And you relied on not just you would have needed more than just a lenient judge. I mean, it is. Some others have said to me privately that there was no combination of lenient judge, correct witnesses. There was no combination.
Yep.
That even if they all lined up the right way, because put the right case in front of a different justice, put the right case in with a different witness, put the right case with a different filing, and run the gambit, and you might get a different result. The word I got was there was no combination in any way, in any frame. Even if put in front of the finest King's Counsel's team, it wouldn't have happened.
That's correct.
So, yeah, that's correct.
No, that's correct. I always say, whenever I run a license appeal, I could run it 100 times before 100 different magistrates and get slightly different results each time. It depends on a multitude of factors, whether or not the magistrate will favour you or not. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's in that crux. But whenever you have a case like this on the law that just doesn't stand up, and not just his case, but just generally those vaccine cases, they don't stand on the law. It wouldn't matter how lenient the judge is; they have to decide the matter on the law. It will be extremely hard for a judge to go in that direction and find the decision. Now,
these cases take a lot of money to run and crowdfund.
Yes.
And another case that ended up was the towers in Melbourne.
Yeah.
That raised close to $800,000, $650 at this point, but $800,000.
That's right.
I think anyone would look at that and say that's a staggering sum.
It is.
Would this case have cost $800,000 to run?
No, I don't think it would have it wouldn't have cost that much. With all the appeals that you probably would have ended up facing afterwards, you might have ended up coming to a very high amount. The reality is this case, I actually think this case, if it ran, would have been a decent case to hear, and I think it was necessary that it actually run. It's unfortunate that things have sort of stagnated the way they have due to Mustafa being struck off, and I think the reasons for her being struck off are fairly standard. I wouldn't say there's anything out of the ordinary. If you are calling out judges, and if you are calling into question their integrity, there is going to be a professional consequence for that. And the same thing occurred with Nathan Buckley. The way that he was tweeting during some of the cases that were going before Justice Beach Jones in New South Wales, it was a very similar thing. In terms of this case was probably one of the better ideas in terms of a class action for this sort of arbitrary lockdown of the towers. Towers obviously were largely people that were low income as well who were living in these towers, and they were subject to extremely terrible conditions. It's not that this wouldn't have prospects, it's just simply the sum is extremely large. If you're running a large class action, like I think this had hundreds of people in it, it wouldn't be unexpected that you would be able to raise a whole lot of money. But the matter, I don't think, should cost that much, which means that you'd probably have money left over for appeals. You might have to end up returning some of it. Some of it might end up being used for costs, which is the other issue, if you get costs awarded against your clients. And that would be an expected result if this case lost.
If I can highlight, Mustafa, according to The Age, lost control of the funds later on.
That's correct.
And it was transferred over to Hall and Wilcox, who, of most commercial law firms, that $650,000 can just disappear in a few billable hours if you're not put in front of a cost assessor.
Well, this is the issue. So the difficulty that we have now is that I'm pretty sure her practice is actually in the administration that's been of Hall and Wilcox, that's actually been assigned by the Victorian Legal Services Board. And of course, with that administration occurring, there is going to be bills from Hall and Wilcox in relation to their work administering her caseload. And taking care of obviously all of these matters. Ultimately, yes, that will end up being whittled down. There is going to be some implication in relation to that, which is why I say it's unfortunate that the personalities ultimately overcame some of the merits of the cases that they were organising. I'm not saying this case would have been successful. I don't know it well enough to comment on that. But it was at least an arguable case that should have been brought before the court after something as draconian as the tower lockdowns occurred. But it's true to the pandemic. This period of time, like I was saying in the beginning of our chat, at the end of the day, the personalities that have come into the mix are probably too big for this sort of environment. The legal profession is a very conservative profession, and I don't mean that in a sort of left and right fashion. I mean it's a profession that's meant to be quiet spoken. It's not meant to be politically loud.
Modest.
Very modest, yes.
Humble. Well, maybe not humble, depending on if they've got letters after their name.
There's an element of flash.
Oh, absolutely, but the flash is unlike what we'd be used to in the modern social media
That's right.
jumble.
Yeah, that's right.
Shouting is an almost immediate cross off the mark.
That's right.
If I can say that the personalities that have come into this, there's some good cases that have been tried to push forward that didn't necessarily work, but that these bad cases inevitably end up to be the highlight.
Yes.
In fact, I said before we began that it's something that I want to focus on simply because it's just what gets the attention. We're not particularly interested in a case that might have won or not, and there's not much spice around it.
Yeah.
But raising almost $1 million only for it to be seized by someone because you went to a protest and you called personally out judges in order to personally harass them, that it gets attention. That is attention grabbing.
Yeah.
Whereas the couple of other cases which I'm going to ask you to go into, which are the good cases, they're just not, it's just not as exciting. And I'm going to ask that these bad cases, they take energy away from the good cases. They take money, they take time, they take energy, they take probably the most important in a modern social media world, they take reputation away.
They do.
They tarnish the view because inevitably Nathan or Serene's reputation shines upon everyone else's in the profession and on anyone who might pursue these same cases like yourself, which is why you're speaking out at this point and saying something about it, because I'm getting from you that you want to run good cases that have a chance of winning.
That's right.
That aren't just Hail Marys or not even Hail Marys, that are just never going to work. And worse, raise $1 million for Buckley's for Buckley's chance. And that's why we're speaking today.
Well, that's it. Well, I think for me, I've had an ongoing frustration. I mean, this is all coming to an end now. There's not going to be any new challenges, I don't suspect, anytime soon. I'm certainly not going to be running anything, I don't suspect, going forward. I did start just one challenge of some note, but ultimately I'm no longer on that matter anyway. I've moved law firms, and that matter's changed hands to other very experienced lawyers, still with very good barristers involved. So it's still going ahead, so far as I'm aware. Me just being an employee of a law firm, I moved on, and obviously you can't take things automatically with you, nor should you. Things they have to find their own sort of way, and they have to go to the right place to make sure that they're moving forward. What
was your experience like with Fight the Fines?
It was I would say it was ultimately fairly orthodox in the sense that Fight the Fines campaign was a third party, which was Rebel News, crowdfunding money, didn't really have anything to do with that wing of things. And then what we would do is we would get these clients referred to us by them, and then they would say, look, this is the case. What do you think? I had a number of cases where I would say, no, I don't think this has got any legs to it. I would provide advice to some people, obviously, just on the basis that they were referred to me. Sometimes, a lot of the time, I wouldn't even take any fee for it. Our firm wouldn't take any fee for it. Other cases, there was a sexy story for the Rebel News, and then at the same time, it was a good case. So it would pair up and we'd run it. Yeah. And for us, it was we would issue a costs agreement. It would set out exactly how much we're planning on charging for the matter, our estimate. Yep. And then they would agree through as a third party to pay the bill for the client. And it was very simple. It's quite a number of law firms will do these kinds of third party arrangements. We never raised any money ourselves. And I was very particular about it. I didn't want to have anything to do with raising money directly. I don't think it's generally appropriate for lawyers to go out into the community cap in hand and ask for money. I think we run trust accounts for particular reasons. The money is placed on trust for that reason, And if it's not used for that reason, we're accountable to that. I don't think just handing over money in an unqualified manner is right for us as a practice as lawyers. But at the same time, things sort of during that period, there was a number of cases that were good, a number of cases that were okay. Any of the bad ones, I certainly wouldn't run. I didn't believe in running any of the bad ones. I thought it would be a waste of whatever resources Rebel had. Moreover, I don't think that it's worth putting clients at risk, particularly in criminal contexts, where if they run the matter, they could end up getting more severe consequences by running it. Now, obviously, some people would still go off and run matters on their own. That happens. But ultimately, as lawyers, we have to give the most sound advice that we can. And sometimes that means matters should settle, matters should be just taken straight to sentence. Or alternatively, some people, they just had to cop the fine. And that happened quite a lot too. Your hands are bound ultimately by what the law allows you to do. And if the system doesn't allow you to make those giant, far-reaching arguments, arguably, you shouldn't be wasting the court's time, nor should you be wasting the resources of your client and putting them at risk of costs or criminal sanction by taking those kinds of cases. But with that said, Chris, a lot of these cases were purely the communities demanding something happen. And I can't really explain the level of emotion that comes from cases like I was telling you about earlier. It's profound. You get people calling in utter desperation, and you get lawyers that are very well-meaning, oftentimes, going on these crusades that don't necessarily end anywhere good, and were never destined to end anywhere good. But they feel like they have to do something. That level of emotion I don't think necessarily produces good law, even if it's accepted. But ultimately, that community demand was pushed towards us as legal practitioners because there was no one in the political arena that was listening to the public, to the disenfranchised members of the public that lost their businesses or lost their jobs, couldn't go to university, couldn't go to school. Their politicians weren't listening to them, so they were coming to us to find answers. And a lot of the time, we couldn't give them that. It's not our fault. But I think ultimately there needs to be more accountability to the lawyers that did promise the world. There were a lot of lawyers that promised, we would be able to knock this whole thing out. And ultimately that's, it was over-promising and it was never destined to deliver anything, essentially. It just made people feel like something was happening. But I don't think litigation should be used just for that purpose. Put it that way.
There are some good cases, if I can bring you to a couple of good cases to talk about that had more than a Buckley's chance of winning. That Cotter remains you sent over before we sat down. That was an example of something that it might be good. That can you tell us just?
Sure. Well, my understanding of this matter is, and I wasn't on this matter, but Miss Cotterill was essentially going for a walk within her 5 kilometres or whatever the radius was. She was holding a sign with a political message on it. Ultimately, this case lost, but I always found this case would be an example of a good case to run. It was run by very sound lawyers. It had very good barristers on the matter. It was run in a good way, a very sound way. And ultimately, it challenged not only the validity of the Cho directions, but it challenged them specifically in relation to the implied freedom of political communication, which is a acknowledged and recognised constitutional principle. And it's a recognised limit on constitutional on authority, not only of state but federal governments. Now, in this case, the one judge of the Victorian Supreme Court that was sitting on this matter dismissed the application. I felt like on this matter should have been given attention for appeal. And I actually filed a very similar veined matter involving a little bit more argument in relation to the principle of legality, because protests were never expressly prohibited during the pandemic, that I felt was, in some sense, an attempt in New South Wales where the circumstances and the legal framework was a bit different. There was no state of emergency, for example. I felt that it was a necessary argument that this was something which should actually go up on appeal to the Court of Appeal and then to the High Court.
What jumps out at me is implied freedom,
yes.
or just the word implied
yes.
as opposed to
yes.
explicit.
Yes.
We don't have an explicit freedom of political communication. We don't have a first for. We don't have amendments in our or bills of rights to rely upon in our constitution.
That's right.
So, was this case relying on an implication?
Well, the implied freedom is implied because there's no, as you said, there's no express provision. There's no First Amendment in the Constitution. It's implied from a number of provisions within our Constitution. And it's based on the idea that because a country like Australia is a democratic country, we have elections. It's necessary as sort of an incident to those elections and the democratic process that you would need a particular level of political free speech in order to sustain that system of democracy. So the idea of the implied freedom is essentially, particularly when it comes to political speech, that is protected from government encroachment. But the encroachment is tested on a proportionality standard. So it's by no means an absolute freedom. The government can justify its burdening of that freedom on the basis that it was proportionate to whatever the goal is they were attempting to achieve. Now, in our case, or in this case, I would have found, and I have a number of colleagues at the bar who think that the reasoning that was offered is in error. That if this was taken on appeal, it would actually have legs to stand on. That judges would find different outcomes to this, because ultimately the burden, essentially at this point in time, was somewhat absolute. And the argument which a lot of people gave in reply was, well, you can push people out of the public square and onto online forums.
Oh, online protests.
Online protests. But the difficulty is... That's right, but the difficulty is the online space, for example, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is it's ultimately a private domain. A private domain...
You need to be hosted by a social media giant who needs to invite you onto their platform.
That's right.
And it is not a... If it was a government-run public square, then that's, again, back to public space.
It would be akin to that, yes. I mean, for me, I think nothing can replace the public square. But you know, the argument that you can have protests online or you can have political messaging online, it's true if the private platform allows you that. So you can't replace the public square in the sense that the public square is subject to all of these recognised rights. It's one of the reasons in the US we can see it right now happening. There is no First Amendment on Facebook. No. There is a First Amendment in the town square.
But what I say with this is, while the discussion we're having is philosophical, we're having a philosophical discussion.
That's constitutional.
Well said.
Yeah.
But again, a case that relies on an implied freedom of political communication.
Oh, it's by no means certain.
Yeah.
No, of course not.
That's the out there. Well, but if I can say, if this is one of the better cases,
yes.
If this is one of the better cases, it says a little bit, partially about the legal challenges that come up, but also the last 10 to 20 years since I would put forward the Australia card or the Wharfies disputes as two examples of a change in privacy, freedoms, liberty. There's two tent poles between that, and I think it was Patrick's was 98, 99, something like that. How far we've come from those two places to today. What other key landmark decisions can you think of that really shifted the sands from a freewheeling, go wherever you want, pre-communist, before the Second World War Australia, to today? What are some other key decisions?
Look, there's a host of constitutional law decisions that you could refer to. The Engineers decision in 1920 ultimately fundamentally shifted the landscape, and we've continued on that trajectory, such that it changed the dynamic of federalism, and it led to a profound consolidation of power in the federal government and a detraction away from principles of our constitution that would be more American in favour of more British principles. So, for example, the principle of responsible government was extremely prominent in that decision. Now, the difficulty with cases like this is they're too old to challenge. If you challenge this kind of case, you'll never get leave to challenge this in the High Court. But even if you were, you'd have to throw out a whole lot of case law because it's literally 100 plus years old. So this is where it starts to go off in its own direction. But since the Communist Party case, which was obviously later, the country has moved in a direction of progressively becoming more and more tolerant of political borders being closed. And we can see this now, for example, with political speech being suppressed in the form of, banning of particular symbols, banning of particular ideas, which is, I mean, that's exactly what's been happening. It's been happening on a mass scale.
Just a few weeks ago, there was something happening in the US. White Nacho, Proud Boys, Antifa, normal American discourse. And there was a swastika in one of the frames. And I was going to post it because I'm like, yep, welcome to Portland, business as usual, swastikas versus Antifa, pepper spray, normal. Let's check in on Portland, how Portland's doing. And I went, I can't post this. I don't know. Can I post a video which has a swastika in it? I'm in New South Wales. Public display of it is banned. I know I probably could have.
You probably are under an exception posting it for media-related purposes or education-related purposes.
Am I media? Because I've run into more than one police officer who disagrees with that.
Well,
and I think many would disagree that I'm media, and that then becomes debatable.
It does.
Do I want to post a video that's debatable as to whether I breach it and become that landmark first case just so I can show some more street fighting in Portland? And the answer was not really.
Why take the risk? Yeah,
Why
that's
take
what
the risk?
comes down to it, yeah.
But that's where freedom of speech and discussion is. It all becomes riskier and riskier. We tend to think of freedom of speech as it's a 1 or a 0. You either can or you can't. No, it's the slow whittling away of, it's really not worth discussing whether vaccines are good or bad. We just won't talk about it. It's really not worth discussing, I don't know, green environmentalism. We should just go with it. Let's not disagree with it or also get deplatformed for climate change denial. Let's just not. It's not a immediate, as much of it is a ban. A lot of it just comes in and, we'll just not talk about it. Hush, hush.
Yeah. Well, my background, you can probably tell from my funny last name, is I'm half Iranian. And the thing about totalitarian regimes like you have in Iran is that they're not going around and beating every woman that has her hair uncovered, right?
Yeah.
They go around and they make an example out of one, and then the others will all self-edit. And this is the thing that's popped up, especially around the pandemic, keeping on that point. It wasn't necessary for it to be a totalitarian situation where the government's going around enforcing the rules on everyone. All they had to do was make enough examples and the rest of us would comply. Like the media was very complicit in this. They had a few shots of people being pulled over leaving Sydney and suddenly everyone thought that there was an occupying force around Sydney, this ring of steel where you couldn't leave. And then I had other people calling me and saying, there's not a cop for miles on this road. It's a massive attempt to psychologically manipulate the public. Totalitarianism and authoritarianism is not the product of just a boot on your neck. It's also the state of mind that it puts its citizens in, that they know that the boot is a real threat and they will actively avoid the punishment of the boot. That's exactly what we experienced.
Something I often mention is my concern is not so much of a state-run media. We already have that with the ABC and in other ways, and university degrees and have their own certain control of who goes into media. It tends to be people who come from those universities which have a curriculum, blah, blah, blah. I'm more concerned about a media-run state. I'm more concerned about a government which makes its decisions almost entirely on daily opinion polls from TikTok. I'm more concerned about this reverse influence that we're just not really getting into, because as all of these devices enter into our hands, our telescreens that we have surrounding us more and more, we're influencing the state with what we believe and what we're made to believe as well. And this other direction is something I'm trying to throw that term out there.
Well, no, I think it's a fairly good term to put there. I think I've heard you use this term before, and I actually quite.
Oh, great!
I think it's quite appropriate, and not just. I mean, you had an example of that in relation to old media. Every day with those presses that they were doing with Berejiklian, you could see she would come to give her presser on a Monday. And, we talk about the case numbers, we talk about what the plans were, what new draconian restrictions were being brought in. Ultimately, that all proved to be unnecessary when we reflect and we look back with the benefit of hindsight, as now everyone is doing. At the end of the day, she would come out and she'd say, I'm doing this. The media would say, why aren't you doing that? And she would say, well, there's no health advice saying that that's going to produce any outcome. And then ultimately what you'd see is the media would be on her tail. She's not doing enough. She's not doing enough. The next day we would have the Premier come and say, oh, well, I'm actually adding that to the mix as well. And, Perrottet, whether he did it on purpose or not, made slip for this at the beginning of the year. He said that the QR check-ins oh, well, it was purely to make people feel comfortable. There was never any scientific evidence that it was affecting the outcomes once the numbers got more than a few.
Why are we outraged at him being honest? He was being honest.
I'm not outraged. My outrage is directed at the fact that he was complicit in all of that throughout the pandemic, and that his honesty is only after the fact when he realises that things are trajectorying away from that it's going to look very bad if this continues. And you can see that with premiers like Daniel Andrews.
Who is a deeply popular premier.
He is deeply
in politics,
popular, yeah.
It's far more important to be popular than right.
In the immediate, yeah.
And absolutely in the immediate, but
Yeah.
trying to find a politician over the past few years who's been right about something.
Yeah.
Maybe a politician who was right about the Iraq War is probably the best example of that 2003 period of someone was out there protesting against it. Have we gone back to them years later and lauded them with political gifts and lifted them up into a position of high office as a soothsayer, a predictor that we all need? We need this man who can look into the future because he saw Iraq, and we've just gone, no, they're just weird. We're not lifting up Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders. We're not lifting these people up and saying, oh, it was so good that they were against the Iraq War. We've gone, geez, he was a bit weird. It was out of place.
And you say Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders, we're not lifting him up just because he was good on the Iraq War. I mean, he gets lifted up because he's promising people free stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is, just as you saw, for example, in Victoria and in the other states where it was done, you could get away with all of those things as long as you promise people candy. That was what was happening. Yeah, they were promising people bribes, and people were selling themselves for those bribes.
Yes.
So you can lock me down as long as you pay me the JobKeeper or whatever it was, so that I can sustain myself for that period of time. But at the end of the day, as much as that was occurring, as much as the people are, and this has been going all the way through history, bread and games, as the very famous line goes in ancient Rome. As much as that is something which is ultimately successful in the short term, the complete abandonment of principle, societal principle, constitutional principle that occurs around that is what leads to the destruction of nations, leads to the destruction of culture. The abandonment of fundamental principles that we held very valuable in the West, right to self-determination, bodily autonomy, freedom of political speech, freedom of speech generally, freedom of religion, which was, no one's ever really done an accounting of what happened in the last 2 years in relation to the closure of churches. It's unprecedented in the 20th century in the Western world that churches were closed, mosques were closed, synagogues were closed on the level that they were. In the 21st century, in the period of human rights, we've had the Human Rights Declaration for, the better part of the last 100 years. The reality is they managed to en masse close all of these buildings and completely burden people's ability to practice their religion. These principles went out the window because they were getting candy.
To be fair, most of these people are ending up as minorities. Christianity is down to 41%.
It's heading in that direction. Yeah.
So many would say that a larger... In Sydney, I believe that agnosticism is close to that certain significance status. If you take just the inner city, I think you'll find it majority.
Yeah,
so in those densely packed areas, religion, if we can look at that, isn't that important? Or is this the other side where religion isn't important because of the different policies we put in place, because we don't need to rely on community? So I'll put to you that is that just a sign of the times, that we just don't need it anymore now that we've got something new to believe in?
It is and it isn't. I think what I would say is that the fact that the demographics have shifted ultimately shouldn't be any point in relation to the underlying principles of the society. If there were 300 Baha'is in Sydney, that wouldn't be any excuse to close their temple by the majority. The same thing, just because the number of people that are professing a religious affiliation should not be any basis to say, well, because there's less and less people there, there's less and less importance whether the churches are open and closed, because ultimately very few people are attending, which is, I'm guessing, what some of the inner city argument would be.
I'm going to rely on the implied freedoms that we were talking about, and just as we entertain and laud the Muslim AFLW players for refusing to participate in the Pride rounds, whereas any Christian objection to it, even not by Thoburn but by someone else at his church, not him, is seen as reason for cancellation. With no satire whatsoever, there's an implied hierarchy that I just don't think many people are picking up on.
No, I agree.
And I don't mean this in a sense of a snide of, oh, there's a hierarchy. No, there is.
Yeah.
Get used to it. And until you identify and accept the reality that there is a hierarchy.
There is. No, I agree with you.
This is not a hypocrisy. we're often looking at this. Look at the hypocrisy. No, there is an implied hierarchy in the same way that case was implied. Of certain religions have a different level.
They do.
And you can say they agree.
I agree with you. I think in a social sense, that's correct. I think society puts different values on different things, and that's based on a number of factors. My eyes as a legal practitioner, as someone who has a bigger perception of, for example, the macro structures of our society, constitutional structures of our society, my eye is very firmly fixed on the principle and how these social changes are moving us away from those principles. I agree with you that those social changes are happening. I'm just very, very strongly trying to raise the alarms. I tried in a professional way, in a way that wasn't alarmist or over the top or dramatic. I wasn't addressing large crowds or anything, because I think it's inappropriate for someone in my position to do that. But at the end of the day, because ultimately I think you can either be the protester or you can be their lawyer. You can't really be both. I think you've got to know which hat you have on. You know, I was a political candidate at the last election. Probably very few people heard from me or heard of me, because I wasn't out there making a big show and dance of myself. I wasn't trolling on Twitter. I didn't have anything like that. I'm still Cameron the lawyer, even when I'm trying to be involved in politics, because ultimately I'm a citizen. I have agency. I'm involved. But I have to maintain who I am. I can't go and pretend I'm just taking one hat off and throwing it away, and everyone's just going to take me as Cameron the political candidate, Cameron the troll, whatever it might be, so that I can then say, okay, well, I'm done with that now. I'm back to being a lawyer. Look at me as a professional. We have to understand that the way that we are perceived by the public is extremely important, especially in a conservative profession like the law. We have to be as upright as possible. It's one of the reasons I try not to take shots at people. I try to take shots at ideas, but when I see sort of the foul plays, I try and call them out as best I can. You know, you've got to maintain a certain credibility with the public, particularly whenever you're handling sensitive matters, like, for example, they're legal cases. There has to be a credibility to you. If you're out there and you're addressing crowds and addressing people in a sort of political sense from the top of a podium, and you're making outrageous claims, you can't then expect it all to be hunky dory when you arrive in court. Now, if I've ever said anything that's unqualified, I've either qualified it later, or alternatively, I'll be the first one to admit I probably should add more detail to that. There's a number of people in our profession who simply don't have that characteristic. They were very happy to grandstand. They were very happy to fly off the rails, and I tried to steer clear as best I could of those people as well, because mud sticks to not only you but the people around you.
So what's the alternative? I've raised a couple of individuals who raised cases which had a very poor chance of getting there. But if I can put forward at the time, there wasn't anyone saying that otherwise. Like if you tried to search for someone, no one, because they were shying away from the public eye around that time, was putting out a debunking.
That's true.
I think of Recator Law in the US.
Yep.
He's probably far to the right, but he's a solicitor who debunks things. He puts himself out there. He puts himself into the social media eye, where in the law profession, there's almost no one in Australia that I can think of or know of. If you are, please drop me a line. I'd love to speak with you, highlight you, because I'm just not aware of it. But over in the US, I can think of that. Can you think of anyone who debunked this? Can you think of anyone at this point who stepped into the public eye and said, "Hey, this has got Buckley's. This isn't going to work"?
No, I genuinely can say. I mean, that's one area where I'm very active. I say the legal profession failed during the pandemic because, and I think I mentioned this in the beginning, because no one came out from the higher echelons of our profession and said, okay, well, I will be part of this sort of group of 20 barristers and 20 solicitors that are going to spearhead sort of the major legal challenges on rational and pragmatic grounds. Because the legal profession very conservatively waited to see what would happen, or just simply didn't care. There are a number of very, very pro-power and pro-government people in the profession as well. Because they hung back, the gap was filled by a lot of people who were alarmist or were simply throwing things out there to see what would work. And ultimately, we didn't come to the foreground and debunk. Now, someone like me, I tried whenever I was given a platform where I could put my message conservatively without being expected to say things that were outrageous to please a crowd. I tried to make things clear. I tried to clarify the points. I mean, I had a whole lot of people calling up, asking me questions about what I would deem pseudo-law, which was being propagated not only by some of my colleagues in the profession at the time, but was being propagated by people who weren't lawyers. And that was the other aspect of it, because there was no answers being offered by the legal profession on large. The gap was being filled by these pseudo-lawyers that were not educated in the law. They were coming to the foreground. They have Instagrams or Twitters or any of those apps. And they were having these huge groups formed where they would propagate essentially legal fictions about, if you simply say no, you can avoid all of this.
You can,
or you can
citizen.
Yeah, you can privately prosecute Dan Andrews or something like that. These things were never rational. They were never logical. And a lot of these people that were the do-it-yourself types, they think they're doing a great job, and more to them for trying. I'm not going to be unkind to them, but they took donations as well, and this is the other aspect of it. People were so desperate they were donating to people with no responsibility to that money. They're not qualified. They're not subject to any professional conduct rules at all. They were just getting the money to run these cases. And I always said, well, with Nathan, I understood. With Serena, I understood they were raising money. They have to brief barristers. They have to pay court fees. They have to do other disbursements, brief experts. With a lot of these do-it-yourself people, I didn't understand it. What was the legal fees? Were they paying themselves a salary? And ultimately, I realised later the real legal fees were they were having to refile the documents time and again because they were making so many rookie errors in the filings that it was just being kicked out. You got to go back, file it again, cost.
Yeah.
And this is the issue. Why would you donate money to someone who obviously can't even file the document correctly?
Because they don't have someone such as yourself or another legal influencer in the modern social media sphere who does that. Previously on Channel 9, they would have got in their in-house counsel to be like, oh, this gentleman is full of rubbish. That's not happening anymore.
No.
And that, in some ways, we've always a double-edged sword with the new liberty we have of creating our own safe spaces of communication.
That's right.
We also don't have to get challenged.
We get echo chamber. But this is the other point too. I had people who did come to me and I told them, I said, no, your case will be disastrous to run and it shouldn't be run. And they would advice shop. And where they weren't getting the advice from me as a legal practitioner that they wanted, they would say, well, you obviously don't know what you're talking about. They would go and they would talk to one of these pseudo-lawyers. And that was the thing, that wherever the gaps were obvious, a lot of these pseudo-lawyers would turn around, and I say pseudo-lawyers in the sense they're not actual lawyers. They're just members of the public that have decided to pick up a textbook and read into it. These people have turned around and said, well, that's because there's a conspiracy. That's because Cameron's part of the conspiracy or ex-lawyer is part of the conspiracy.
Right. Lightning round. Are you a Freemason?
No.
What else? What else can we get through here? You're a lawyer. Are you a member of the World Economic Forum?
No.
Are you a member of the Liberal Party?
No.
What else? Are you part of any grander conspiracies?
No, I'm pretty. I would say I'm pretty well centered just generally in society. I'm a Western Sydney guy. I'm not silver spoon raised. As I've already mentioned, my dad's an Iranian migrant, so I've got the experience of tyranny in my family. I have relatives right now over there currently in the midst of that. I've lived the experience through my father, through my family. I know what it looks like. The alarm bells were being raised by him at the very first outset of all this. So I already knew that this was going to end up exactly where it did 2 years later. I was ringing the alarm bells probably from about April of 2020. I copped a pretty harsh watering down by a lot of colleagues who eventually came back on board. They said, yeah, you were right. But at the end of the day, with the benefit of hindsight, everyone can be right. What matters is what you're doing in the moment. But one man against an entire wave of hysteria does nothing. So you just got to ride it out. But no conspiracy theories, no Freemasons. I'm not a member of the Labor or the Liberal Party. I'm in favour of economic decentralisation, political decentralisation. I believe in more power to the individual. you spout them off. I don't have any interest in the control of the public or control of the individual. I have no agenda to make the government more powerful. My goal, if I could get my hands on the Constitution, would be to create more limitations on what the government can do. I think that's the more ideal situation. Why would I construe my advice in such a way to try and make X person who's got a fruitless sort of case on their hands not challenge the constitutionality of some pandemic restriction or another? There's no agenda there. I just gave my legal advice, and then you get, well, you're part of the conspiracy.
Cam, how do we find out more about you? Do you have a page that we can follow or social media?
I have a website. I've got Twitter. C Shamsabad, I think, is my Twitter handle. I have an old candidates Facebook page, but true to I would say, like most lawyers, I don't really advertise myself too much. I try not to. And the reality is, there's the same thing with members of the bar. You don't really advertise. For me, if you want to reach out to me, email. If you have legal matters, I'm with Solve Legal in North Sydney. And happy to give advice, happy to give assistance wherever I can to the public. But ultimately, I like to keep as low profile as possible.
Until now.
Until now. Now I'm on your channel.
Cam, thank you very much for this time.
Thank you, Chris.
Speak to you again soon.
Thank you. Speak soon. Thank you.
Yeah, great.